Making a game is hard, especially if you're a solo dev like me. And if you're just starting out, you might be thinking about using pixel art for your game. Indie developers love using pixel art both for the classic look and how beginner friendly it is, since it's approachable for both artists and coders. But it's not that simple. As someone that's made multiple games using pixel art, I fell into many pitfalls that cost me countless hours to fix. Today, I'll share with you some of the biggest mistakes I made and how I fixed them. These tips apply whether you're using Godot, Unity, or a custom engine, so don't worry. By the end of the video, you'll be ready to make your first game using pixel art. Beginners tend to overlook this step, yet it's one of the most crucial things you need to figure out before you even start. And that is, you should always know what native resolution your game would run at. This is doubly true for pixel art games, since resizing assets with pixel art requires you to scale using integers. This just means if you're not scaling at whole numbers like 2, 3, or 4 times, you will get blurry or distorted pixels, making it almost impossible to resize your assets without redrawing them. Luckily, it's actually quite simple. If you're not sure, you can always go for a 640 by 360 pixel native resolution, which scales perfectly to 720p at 2x, 1080p at 3x, and 1440p at 4x. This works so well because Steam shows the most used screen sizes each year, and the vast majority of users have one of those 3 resolutions. Blasphemous and Sea of Stars are 2 examples of great looking and successful pixel art games. So if it works for them, it'll work for you too. I find that size to give you enough space for detail on larger assets while still being small enough to make simple and good looking assets very fast. Of course, if you're going for a true retro style game, consider using that console's native resolution. Now that you have your target resolution, it's time for the next step before you start making assets. I find that for some reason, newer devs are either afraid to commit to this or simply don't put enough thought into it. And of course, I'm talking about style. More importantly, having intention with your style. As a pixel art enjoyer, I'm always inspired by other great games with pixel art, and it's so easy to adopt the look of those games without really knowing what makes it work. For example, with my game, I originally made a tile set with a perspective similar to Fire Emblem. While it has a distinct classic tactics RPG look, I don't think it translates very well to modern pixel art, especially with the mechanics of my game being more focused on interacting with the environment. The scale and perspective in the old school Fire Emblem games is pretty abstract, as almost everything has to fit in one tile. This means a shop, a castle, and a tree will all have to fit on the same size. While charming in its own way, I don't think I understand the style enough to do it justice. By switching to a more traditional top-down RPG style and taking advantage of modern engines, I can draw on multiple layers, and I'm able to add more detailed and larger structures that don't have to be confined to a strict tile set. Many modern pixel art games are actually like this, and they use pixel art almost exclusively just for the aesthetic, whereas retro pixel art games often have quirks that are limited by hardware. Another good example of this would be palette restriction. Retro games use a restricted palette out of necessity, but for you, it could be worth it to break the palette, and even use shaders to create a nostalgic yet modern looking pixel art game. Using a restricted palette requires some knowledge of color theory, and I think for beginners, it's best to just start with a small palette, but not be afraid to add more colors when needed. That way you get the best of both worlds between cohesion and simplicity. Either way, it's best to decide on a style early and maintain a consistent visual for your game. Now you're ready to make assets, but before you start, I want to share something that has legit saved me hundreds of hours, yet I feel like it's rarely talked about. And that is to always think about ways to reuse your assets. This point is especially true if you're a solo dev or if you're doing a game jam. So one thing I've learned the hard way is that animating pixel art just takes a really long time and energy. For instance, if you're using 2D hand-drawn sprites or 3D models, you can actually reuse animations between characters that have similar models. Whereas with pixel art, even something as simple as a walk cycle can't really be reused. You would need to animate at least 4 directions per character, not to mention any idle, attacks, or special animations. Add in a few more characters and enemies and you're looking at hundreds of frames you would need to draw. There are 2 major strategies I use to save a lot of time. The first one is to use generic sprites where a lot of animation is needed, and save detailed, unique sprites for places where it really matters. For example, in old school Fire Emblem, classes share the same sprite in the overworld. Let's look at these 2 characters, Kent and Sane. Both of them have the same generic cavalier sprite in the overworld, with lots of shared animations because they have the same class. Now simply give each of them a detailed, unique portrait and you're good to go. Not to mention now that every time you want to add a new character of the same class, it will only take a fraction of the time. Tons of games do this even to this day, including big budget AAA games. You see this most often with nameless NPCs in big cities, but it can work even with playable characters without ruining immersion, as long as you establish this as part of your world early and remain consistent with it. I started developing animating each of my characters using unique sprites, but I quickly realized that's going to be completely impossible if I want to actually release my game in a reasonable timeline. So I decided to use Fire Emblem's approach and use generic sprites and add in extra details for places where it really matters. Another common strategy I use is to use the same sprite but just change the colors to make a new character. This is called palette swapping and is a staple for all games. Check out these attack animations. The sprites here have been recolored to match the characters' portraits, red for Kent and green for Sane. This is super easy to do and it adds a lot of immersion. In fact, it's used so commonly for new enemy variations that players won't even question it. So definitely don't feel like you are somehow cheating or being lazy by palette swapping. There are so many other tricks used by clever developers to save time, but the main point here is to always have a plan in mind when making assets so you don't burn out before you actually finish your game. Now I want to talk about something that most indie devs wait until the very end to do, even though I believe nailing it down early can speed up development so much. And that is adding in your UI early, even if it's just placeholder. We already know now just how annoying it can be to have to resize your pixel art assets, and just by adding placeholder UI early, you can actually save a ton of time. With placeholder assets, you can be trying out different sizes for your menus, character portraits, ability icons, anything really, and just by doing that, you're already going to make a big difference. But you can take it one step further. Simply put, don't be lazy like me and use the right controls from the beginning. So the recommended way to play my game would be with a controller or keyboard, but I actually spent the first 2 months developing just using my mouse and some hard-coded key presses to test functions. While this can be faster in the moment, I don't really think it's worth it in the long run, as not only will this be annoying to switch out of later, it also alters the way you approach UI UX. Just by changing my development to actually use a controller, I'm able to notice right away all the lacking parts of my UI, like awkward menu navigation, missing parts of the HUD, unclear instructions, etc. This tip really applies not just to pixel art games, but to all games in general, and it's super underrated. Also, as a bonus, when you have a functional HUD in place, your screenshots look much more like a game, and less like a bunch of random sprites cobbled together, giving your screenshots and GIFs a lot better context. Alright, so this final point I want to share is probably the most important, and definitely something I wish somebody had told me before I started. And that is to be honest with yourself and really consider if you even need to use pixel art. I think there's a misconception that using pixel art is easier or that it's really the only option you have as an indie dev, especially if you're not an artist. And while that may be true to some extent, I also think there are a lot of pitfalls you could run into with pixel art. Especially nowadays, with all the modern engines, tutorials, and pre-made assets out there, you might even have a better time developing your game in 3D if you're more of a programmer. Being comfortable working with 3D and pre-made assets is a super underrated skill for indie devs, and you might not get to develop that if you're so tunneled into one style of game development. Even though I'll be working on 2D pixel art games for the foreseeable future, I'm still planning on learning more about 3D modeling and using shaders, so I have more tools to realize my creative visions in the future. That being said, if you really want to make a pixel art game purely because you enjoy the aesthetics, that's completely valid too, and pretty much why I decided to make my first real game using pixel art. There's a huge community of both players and developers that all enjoy pixel art for a reason. So at the end of the day, don't overthink it and just do whatever makes sense for you. With that, those are 5 things I wish I knew before I started making pixel art games. Drop a like and sub if you learned something, and now I'll give a quick update on my tactics RPG Secrets of Shadows. Real quick for the new viewers, Secrets of Shadows is a tactics RPG I'm working on that's kind of a mix between Fire Emblem, Monster Hunter, and Baldur's Gate 3. I'm trying to make interesting turn-based combat based on how the environment and abilities interact. You can check out my first devlog to learn more if you haven't already. Okay, so for the past month, I've revamped the art style quite a bit and fleshed out the designs for the world. Some of these are still placeholder-ish assets, but this hidden forest tile set I'm working on is coming along quite well. In this area, you will find hidden NPCs, lots of dynamic tiles, and monsters inspired by Japanese mythology and folklore. For the dynamic tiles, I've already implemented the main ones, like breakable walls and burning grass and tree tiles. Okay, I'm gonna be real with you guys here. I actually haven't made as much progress as I hoped for. I was trying to get a demo ready by the end of this month, but that's looking pretty rough right now. So I think I can still get a playable demo by the end of this year, but I also want to make sure it's well polished before I actually release it for Steam. So I'm thinking if there are enough people interested, I could make a Discord, that way I can get some feedback and also give more regular updates there. Let me know in the comments if that's something you want. And that's it for now, thanks for watching, bye!